On the top left, you should see it say that we're live as soon as we are. Spinning. Hopefully we're processing, be waiting for that notice. And boom, we should be live on Facebook. Good morning, everybody. What a special day and what a special guest. So my name is Uri Schneider from Schneider Speech. Today is a day that, as I said before, if you haven't been living under a rock, you know, today is October 22nd. It's International Stuttering Awareness Day. The hashtag on social media is ISAD, ISAD 2020. Around the world, in countries around the world, a global community of people who stutter and people who care for people who stutter kind of use today to add knowledge and understanding and advocacy for people who are living with stuttering, to really feel the camaraderie, the community around them, not to feel alone, that no one should feel alone. And for those of us seeking to understand, whether we're parents, clinicians, people who stutter, teachers, psychologists, whatever, today the internet is filled with mostly good stuff, but like all the time, you got to filter what you read. But there's going to be more posts. So if you're wondering what's going on, why is the stutterverse taking over the internet? That's why. And so it's all the more extraordinary to have with us today someone who is truly a living legend among the giants in the field. When you go to the Stuttering Foundation of America, Jane Fraser, the organization that she leads for decades, and I describe her affectionately as an Energizer bunny. She has the energy of someone younger than me and the experience and the insight and wisdom of someone far beyond me in years, that's for sure. And what she's done, what you'll notice is if you go to the new catalog of the Stuttering Foundation of America, you'll notice that the man whose face you're looking at, to my left, above me, to my right, I'm not sure how it appears on your screen, this man appears on a lot of the material. So Joe Donaher is someone who's been around and continues to contribute to the field in incredible ways. He's active at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I'm going to make it informal. He also is on faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. And he is an editor and on the reviewing board and just on every important place that you need to be, contributing to the literature, culling the literature and really bringing the best knowledge out to the floor. He's been doing it for decades, and it's a great privilege to take the time and have a conversation. So thanks for coming on, Joe.
Thank you, and happy International Stuttering Awareness Day.
I was wondering, like, yeah, we got to come up with a good greeting. You know, it's a mouthful.
Yeah, I do. I have been known, and I've been here at the hospital for 23 years, and I think for every International Stuttering Awareness Day, I send the same message out, which is Happy ISAD, please celebrate responsibly. So I'll say the same thing to all of you.
Do you have Irish blood?
I have only Irish blood in me.
Might that explain why you should celebrate responsibly?
Yeah, maybe a little bit. But
I'm looking over your shoulder, and I wonder if that might be a good opening. That seems to be a Philadelphia Eagle, Darren Sproles. Is there any reason, besides the fact that you're in Philadelphia, that Darren Sproles is significant to you?
Sure, and it's a perfect day to say that, because not only is it ISAD, but tonight the Philadelphia Eagles will be defeating the New York Giants to take first place in the division. So
I told you, no politics, and no rivalries. No, we're not going to put down New York or Philadelphia. Yeah, okay, but you're expecting the Eagles to put down the Giants.
Sure, but the team that wins will have 2 wins for the season, so it's not really bragging about much when I'm bragging about the Eagles. But
and beating the Giants is not to brag much either.
Exactly. Yeah, our division is a little weak this year, to say the least. But yeah, Darren Sproles is a person who stutters, and he was a communication sciences and disorders major at Kansas State. He has talked about his stuttering. He has been open about it. He's worked with Stuttering Foundation of America. Being in Philadelphia, we brought about 45 kids who stutter and their families with them a few years ago. We had dinner with them, and he knows I'm a very big sports fan after meeting him. And he, as a thank you, he gave me that poster. So I keep it in my office as an inspiration for all the kids I work with who stutter, but also just because I'm a big Eagles fan.
The other thing I love to say about Darren Sproles is most people don't necessarily know. If you're a sports fan, you don't know of his outstanding characteristic of stuttering as much as another feature, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, was he not at the time the shortest player in the NFL?
I believe so. I believe so.
So I'm thinking of Tom Scharstein had a beautiful post on the ISAD conference about, crushing it in life and stuttering. And on the one hand, people who stutter and parents of kids who stutter and teachers need to understand the difference of growing up and speaking with a stutter, and where it's appropriate, make accommodations. And at the same time, there should be no free lunch. No one's entitled to get an A without earning it. No one's entitled to the job without earning it. So sometimes when someone has one challenge, they deserve the accommodation and understanding, but it still means they got to work hard. And I think Darren Sproles is a great example. He had two things, so to speak, strikes against him, but on the football field, certainly being of short stature was something that made people think less of him. And what he did about that was he showed them with his work ethic and with his hard play. And I think for all of us, whether we stutter or not, the idea of earning our stripes and earning the opportunities and the favor of people. One of the things I love to do, this is a quick riff, but when people say, well, how will I get that girl to say yes to me? Or how will I get that guy to say yes to me? Or how will I get that job? My father would often say, well, what do you think they're looking for? What are the top 5 things in their hiring process? Or what are they looking for in a boyfriend or girlfriend? Stuttering or being fluent probably ain't in the top 5. They want someone who's courteous, someone who's thoughtful, someone who's generous, someone who's fun. So if a person is so consumed with the one thing they feel bad about, whatever it might be, and they don't think about what assets do I have, what characteristics do I bring to bear, what value do I bring to this relationship, and they don't put that on the table, it might be doomed, not because of the reason they think it is, but because they didn't put their assets and their value on the table. So I think Darren Sproles, I just love that poster, and even though he's an Eagle.
I like your comparison with the size thing for him too, because if he listened to everybody else, if he listened to the wisdom of the day, if he listened to his coaches and everybody else, he probably would have said, I'm too small to play in the NFL, I'm too small to play at Kansas State, right? But he didn't. And is that because he refused to listen to it? Or is it because he wanted more? Or is it because he was just kind of dedicated and really motivated? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's interesting to look at how he talks about his stuttering in the same vein. So the first time I ever heard him speak was I was actually in a hotel room giving a talk in California for the Stuttering Foundation. And I was just watching SportsCenter, like I normally do at the end of the day. And he was being interviewed because he set the record for the most yards in a single game between punts and kickoff returns and all.
That's right.
And it was, I guess it was his first year in the NFL. He was playing for, I believe, San Diego back then in the beginning. And so he was there and he was interviewed and they were talking about this amazing game. And he started to stutter. And the announcer on ESPN said to him, oh, relax, don't worry. We have time. And he said, oh, no, I'm not nervous. I stutter. And the announcer said something like, right, everybody stutters when they're nervous. And he goes, no, you're not listening to me. I'm a person who stutters. And then he went on and said the rest of his interview. And so just like if he had listened to all those naysayers for football, he wouldn't be playing in the NFL. And if he'd listened to all those folks about his speech, he might have been avoiding his speech more. And what I think is really interesting about him is he rises to that challenge.
Totally. And it makes me think of also Alan Rabinowitz,
Sure.
of blessed memory. And in the film Transcending Stuttering, The Inside Story, which is a free documentary produced by my father, myself, and the team. In that film, he says the hitting rock bottom was when people said things about him because of his stuttering, and he kind of didn't have the courage to own that he was not what they made him out to be, but he actually played and feigned the kind of things that they were accusing him of. Someone said he was retarded. Please excuse him. He's retarded. Give him a few moments. And he actually would act the part. But Darren Sproles, for example, and Alan later in his life certainly stopped selling out, didn't just accept that, but chose to speak up for their dignity. And I think that's such an important message that you brought up from Darren. We see it in Alan, and I think it's an important piece, whether it's a parent advocating for a kid, an ally, a teacher, a kid, a young person, learning to speak up for yourself and don't let other people's ignorance or just misunderstandings
Sure.
Put you down.
And I think an important point with that, and you brought it up brilliantly with Alan Rabinowitz, but also Darren Sproles, it's very easy for us to hold these celebrities up, right, as people who stutter and say, look, they're doing whatever they want. We can look at guys on television, with announcers, with political commentators, sports guys, and it's very easy to say, look, they're not letting it hold them back. But if you back up the track a little bit, if you back up their storyline, even Darren will talk about how he wasn't doing television interviews to the extent he could have. He wasn't doing guest appearances and things. And it took him a while to do that. I was fortunate to work on a show with him called NFL Players Unite, a television show. It was one of his first times really talking about his stuttering, and he helped a person who stutters in that show. So I think it's important as we talk about people not letting their stuttering hold them back, we talk about that as a progression, because it isn't an all or nothing. It's not you avoid or you don't avoid. And I think avoidance is such a big thing in stuttering. And the way I talk about it, both to individuals who stutter and to clinicians, is that avoidance is a normal part of life, right? I avoided traffic today, so I left a little bit earlier and took a different route. Right? I avoided having an argument with my son last night, so I didn't yell at him for something, right? We avoid things all the time. And so as clinicians, we have to remember, if we tell someone who stutters, stop avoiding, that's not in line with what we do in every other way. So what we have to do is start discussing why you're avoiding or what's behind the avoidance and how can we do less of it.
What would you say would be some legitimate ways for parents, for clinicians, teachers? You know, I think that's such an important point, that it's a continuum and it's not linear. It can have ups and downs. So one day someone has no qualms about the presentation in front of class, and another day it's not feeling so strong. Could be their stuttering feels different that day. Could be their spirit, their state is different. You have any tips on how to gauge that? And what are you know, one of the places that always comes up for me is a bar mitzvah or confirmation or some life cycle event. The parent has a conundrum. If I give them a pass, if I respect their resistance, their desire to avoid, will I teach them to avoid for life? On the other hand, if I push them up to the podium, am I going to create a trauma that they're going to forever blame me for? And navigating that is so nuanced. Any tips from your experience?
Yeah, it's a giant topic, which I love getting into that. But if you think about it, how would we get anyone to do anything? And how do we motivate people to do things? And I think the first part of every good clinical relationship has to be kind of a trust there. And we think about trust, we think about faith in the other person, you know, and belief that change is possible. So I would say before we change people's behavior, before we do anything, we have to develop a relationship with the individual and with their families. Okay, I often say that speech language pathologists that work with people who stutter get more Christmas presents. And the reason I say that is because we have a different type of relationship with the families we work with. We know more about them, we're closer to them, we have to get in there a little bit more. I always think the biggest gift someone could give me is working with me in therapy is being honest and open with me, right? So here's kids that come to us who we say to them, I want to talk to you about the most difficult thing in your life that you're struggling with. Go ahead and tell me about it, right? You can't do that unless there's some trust already built there. So when we're talking about avoidance and getting someone to do more instead of avoiding more, I really think go back to the very beginning of the intervention, and you have to build that trust. And if you don't have that relationship, you know therapy doesn't work as well. Okay, I'm sure everyone has thought about this at times, but you have certain therapy sessions that you're like, oh, good, they're coming here today. I'll see them at 3. And you're all excited and really motivated. But we all also have to be honest. There's also those other ones that you don't click with necessarily, that you're not, your goals aren't kind of in line with each other. And it's just a harder time. And those times you're thinking, oh, no, maybe they'll cancel this week, you know, and that's really difficult. And we have to be honest with that. And so if we have a client that we're working with, a family that we're working with, and something's not there, we have to be honest about repairing the relationship before we're going to change anything that we're doing moving forward.
Beautiful. And I just want to give attention to and share with you, Joe, as I did before, there were so many people that poured out so much, warmth and regard. You got a hello from Brandon Parrish. We've got Elizabeth coming in from England. We've got Lucy Ward sending you regards. You guys were classmates. I won't say when. But your impact in the professional community, and as you said, with the people that send you Christmas gifts is legendary.
Thank you.
So we talked beforehand a little bit, we could dive into any number of things, and both of us are so, it's beyond just a job, but maybe you want to talk about a little bit, how did you get into this? You're not one of the people who stutter, right? So how did you find your way into this niche, into this focus? What got you hooked?
Well, it was a long, strange trip, to quote the Grateful Dead a little bit there. And I think about how I get into it. And first of all, by having you invite me to this, I was very honored that you invited me. And it was funny. It was right during the pandemic, and I'm at a hospital, so the pandemic has been a little rough on us, to say the least. And I was talking to my wife, and I told her that I got invited to do this. And I said, it's really nice. He wants me to talk about the field and what has happened and what's going on. And as I'm describing this, I said, I really think all he's doing is telling me I'm old and that I've been around too long. And I started realizing this. And she goes, well, do you know him really well? And I said, well, I know him fair enough. I go, actually, I know his father. And then as soon as I start saying, I know your dad for years and years, I'm like, yep, I'm old. This is tough. So,
no. Well, I'll just tell you, I just want to be clear on my intention is, I think there are a lot of young people, some wonderful up and coming people in the field, in the research, in the PhD track, clinicians on the front lines, more and more people who stutter, who are also entering the field, which has enriched everything on every level. And at the same time, I think there are people like yourself and someone else that I've lined up, Barry Yeoman and Michael Sugarman, and many of your colleagues, as well as the young guns and the young bloods up and coming. Eric Raj is my next conversation from New Jersey, and be speaking with Ruben Schuff as well. So we've got a great lineup, but what you bring, and I think what's so important, we'll get to this at the end perhaps, is what Lee Reeves talked about, the importance of bringing the communities together and what's been accomplished in that regard, and that we cherish that and protect that, because I think that that's an accomplishment from the past several decades, and it didn't just happen.
I agree 100%.
It would be a big loss to see it not be sustained. For those that understand this, for those that don't, it's fine. But as in any community, there's always, certain tribalism and certain feelings of safety and are my interests being met and so on. But we can get to that. But I think you're not here because you're old. You're here because you're still relevant. You're still relevant, and you're sitting there at the hospital on the front line as you have been, and you're as relevant as ever. And that was my intention.
Well, I was kidding you, but so let's think about this a little, right?
Yeah.
So you said I went to grad school a long time ago, right? I was very fortunate in graduate school. I took my first stuttering class from a professor who wasn't the main stuttering professor, because the main stuttering professor was on sabbatical, so I didn't get to meet him yet. So I took a course, and I believe the first thing that the professor said to me after the first paper was, I should never work with anyone who stutters ever. Okay, so being a little bit bullheaded, that annoyed me. And then the next semester, I'm thinking I'm going to hate this second stuttering course, right? I'm not going to like it at all, whatever. The professor comes in, it was Woody Starkweather, right? And so from the beginning, Woody and I hit it off. I learned so much from him. He's one of my mentors in the field. So I was really lucky that when I started learning about stuttering, I was learning from Starkweather, right? And at that point in the field, this would have been about 26 years ago, okay? So at least 26 years ago. So when you think about it, back then in the field, there was really kind of like two islands at the time. And on one island, there was a very strong behavioral emphasis, which changed the behaviors of stuttering. And there were a lot of folks on that island. Then there was a second island, which was kind of a more holistic island that was not just looking at the behaviors of stuttering, but talking about the experience of stuttering, talking about what it's like, the impact of stuttering, and what does it mean to be a person who stutters, rather than just the behavioral approach. We know all the cool people were on the one island, right? And this island wasn't as cool. But it really was a dichotomy.
So those people got voted off the first island. So
exactly, yeah. But it really was that kind of dichotomy. And I can remember when I was really young going to conferences, and you would see presenters and you almost knew, were they a shark or were they a jet? Like you knew the side they were on. And then what I really think is nice is what was at the same time coming up was the self-help movement. And I remember Woody Starkweather telling me I would be better off going to an NSA meeting than an ASHA meeting. So I went to national NSA meetings before I ever went to a national ASHA meeting. And so what was interesting was you had this field kind of developing, an area kind of developing, and at the same time, people who stutter were making their own community because they needed a voice. They needed to say what was best for them instead of a profession telling them that. So at that point, we started to see the NSA really get strong. And I can remember the first time I went to the NSA, I believe it was Woody, I believe I was giving a talk, and he asked all the speech language pathologists to stand up. And there were like 15 speech pathologists in a room of like 200 people. And I was thinking, wow, that's not a great, really big number. And he talked about 5 years before, the number was 3 at the NSA. And now when you look at the NSA, you really see a great deal of speech language pathologists coming in because it's such a great place to learn about stuttering. So it was really interesting back there. You had the self-help community, and then you had the professional community, right? And for me in my journey, I was very fortunate early in my career to hook up with the Stuttering Foundation of America. And in my CFY, I did their 2-week course at Northwestern back there with Hugo Gregory and his team. And that changed so much of what I had learned about stuttering.
Was Kristen Camella in your cohort, or just?
You know, she had already graduated from Northeastern, but she wasn't in my group yet. And I think she came in. I think that's the first time I met Kristen, who now is one of my good friends. But I think that was the first time she came in as a guest speaker to my talk, or to my group. My group, though, had Lisa Scott and I met each other. That's where we met, in that group. And Alex Johnson was in that group as well. So it's just interesting how those kind of courses develop. But
it could be that Woody knew that if you went to ASHA, you wouldn't be learning much because you'd be sitting at the booth in the hall there, in the booth for the Stuttering Foundation of America. You would man that booth. I know Steph is really missing doing that with you, and she said she was going to rearrange her whole pulmonary care around trying to tune in for this. And I just wanted to make a plug. I will post a comment. Our good friend, colleague needs some help. She's going through a really valiant and unbelievable fight with some pulmonary stuff unrelated to COVID, pre-existing stuff. And she and her family could use some help. There's a GoFundMe. So I just wanted to make a plug for that to support a friend and a colleague. But she's just tremendous, and she sends her warmest. So Woody, what you're saying is that Woody Starkweather and Brandon Parrish wants you to know that before he saw you, he saw Woody before he retired. So, and my father also had a very close relationship there, and Woody's work had a big influence on the work that we do as well. So Woody Starkweather said to you, more than ASHA, you'll learn more if you go to this NSA.
Correct.
And that's the message that I've also received from many people. Not just the illustrious Dr. Phil Schneider, my father, but I would just share one anecdote. It was in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was Ed Contour, was just about to retire, one of the greats. And if he wanted to, he could have gone back to the spa. He wasn't slated to speak, but there was a session for parents. And in the back of the room, there were 2 legends sitting there. And it was Ed Contour and my father. And they were the only 2 professionals that said, well, there's a CEU, professional continuing education, but the real learning, you know where it's at? Listening to these real parents. And it sounds like Woody was transmitting that, and you're amplifying that listening to the people who stutter, the community people who stutter, has as much, if not more, value in certain ways than just perusing the literature in the absence of connecting to the people who live with this.
Yeah, and if you don't look at, if you look at stuttering as kind of a static one thing, you might be okay to kind of just go in and do the same thing with every person. But when I get calls all the time and emails, I'm seeing a child who stutters today at 10, what do I do? And just to be a little snarky and a jerk a little bit, I always say, well, which person who stutters? And some people get it right from that comment, but I have no idea what you're supposed to do with a person who stutters. I have no idea what I'm going to do with a family, with a child who stutters who comes to me, until we really start seeing what's going on. You know,
what are the first 3? So I'm with you 200%. My father and I often say, I'm comfortable saying it because I've heard him say it, and it sounds like you as well. I'm always a little nervous because as much experience as I have, clocking, sitting with hundreds of people, it's still a little tenuous. You don't know what's walking in and what they need and where they've been and what's the holistic picture of this human being and what they're looking for. But I think what I go to are what are the things I want to know. We're on the phone. What are the questions I might ask? What would you say would be like 3 questions a clinician or a parent might want to tune into to get a sense of what are some of those important variables aside from the isolated fact that they have interruptions in the flow of speech?
Yeah, great question. I'll tell you, the way I start almost every therapy session, so I'll tell you that because that kind of leads into this a bit. I say the parents, we come in the room, and I almost always have the parents there for at least let's just talk evaluation the first time I meet them. Almost every time I say to the parents, I tell them where to sit, and I say, thank you very much. I'm going to ignore you now. Don't take it personally. I'll bother you later a bunch, but I just want to get to know your son or daughter more. And then when I start talking to the son or daughter, I say, you know, I got all this stuff from your parents. I know where you go to school. I know how old you are. I know your favorite color. I know all this stuff, but they don't have any good stuff in there. I want to know the real junk. I want to know what you like to do for fun, what you like to play with. And that, again, is just what I would do as I've met a friend to meet someone on a regular relationship. So what we're doing is just, I want to listen. I don't want to talk. If I'm doing the talking, then it goes back to that medical model that they come to me to listen to me to get the answer. And I don't think there's a single answer, and I don't know what the question is yet. So really what I want to do is I just want to communicate with them, and then I want to see what's going on a little bit. And I look at my goal for an interaction like that is twofold. You know, I want to see the real life impact of the stuttering, and then I want to see the choices that they make when they communicate. And I really want to look at their ability and desire to communicate. Everyone looks at ability to communicate. They talk about the types of disfluencies, all that junk, right? But more so than just, are you able to express your wants and needs? Are you able to give me longer stories? Or can you tell me all the cool stuff you want to report? I want to know about their desire to communicate, because I'm more interested in the desire than the ability. Ability, if it's just that, we can work on that. But what often happens, as we know, is individuals start listening to those messages in their own head, messages from other people, and so they start limiting what they're doing. So I want to have a general conversation just about regular stuff to see how they communicate.
Well, you know, before we talked, and I did make reference to your Irish blood, so I think it would only be fair to bring on the Jewish blood. You know, we said, you know, how much do we need to prepare? We said, well, just schmooze. It'll just go. Are you familiar with the word milchiks and fleischiks? Do you know that one?
I'm not familiar with that. Yeah.
Gesundheit on that. It's a mouthful. I won't ask you to say it, but it's even harder than my name. But milchiks is dairy, and fleischiks is meat. So in you know, we don't have the chicken parm, right? We don't mix the meat, poultry, and meat with the dairy. So the reason I bring that up is I think of like what you were saying when someone comes in, so they stutter. But you don't know if that person is a pescatarian or if you're a vegetarian. What do you serve them? And what you're going to serve them is going to be informed by things far more than bean counting, how many stutters per syllable spoken. So I think very well said. I would suggest clinicians, parents, I think in addition to finding out what's their junk, what do they do when they relax? You know, Joe's wisdom, I think looking at the parameter of what's their social satisfaction, like socially, how satisfied are they in their social arena? Are they bright enough to keep up with class, or are they struggling academically or cognitively? And then, you know, just motorically, physically, is everything seem to be in check, and they seem to be athletic enough and coordinated enough, especially with the younger ones. But what you hit on, the communicative spirit, right? The desire, the way they communicate is so important. Can you just talk about that? Because I think a lot of people still, unfortunately, and maybe today's the day to highlight, still making predictions about outcomes and therapy plans based on the type of disfluency or the frequency. Can you like bring it together a little bit and just share a little wisdom on that?
Yeah, great point though. So really what I think that gets to is, how do you define severity in stuttering? And really I would say, how do you define stuttering? Because if you look at stuttering as a behavioral issue, a motor behavior, let's say, you're going to treat it with a motor intervention. Right? But we know from a lot of motor research that individuals who stutter have a harder time habituating techniques or habituating behaviors to automaticity, to make movements, motor movements easy, and automatic is tough for many people who stutter. So right there, there's an issue right there if we're trying to teach them motor things, and yet we know from the research there's some motor complications there as well. So let's think about the research, because I don't want this just to be a discussion of what we think. You know, and if we look at the research, we're talking about severity, how much stuttering equals an impact, basically. But if we look at the research, we know that adolescents who stutter, regardless of severity, tend to doubt themselves as communicators, tend to be more isolated, tend to be more ripe for bullying and teasing, tend to be looked at by their peers in more negative ways. So the research shows us that the impact of stuttering goes much deeper than just a set of behaviors, okay? So again, the way you define stuttering is going to really dictate how you intervene with people who stutter. And I really look at severity as the degree to which the stuttering impacts the individual's life. How much of a roadblock is it, in other words, right? And so when we start looking at it that way, that how is it impacting your life, we start thinking about things in a larger kind of context. So then we're talking about social relations with your friends. Do you have a lot of interactions with your friends? Can you, do you have folks you go out with at night? Do you go out on the weekends? Do you feel comfortable interacting with them? Do you feel comfortable introducing yourself to new people when it comes in? How are you doing at school? Are you participating? Are you interacting? Do you feel safe? How is your role in your family? Are they supporting you as a communicator? I mean, all of these things we have to start looking at there. So again, I think when we look at severity, types, frequency, all of that does one thing for us. It helps us with diagnosing stuttering and things like that. But we have to think about what is the stuttering problem, because to me, the stuttering problem very rarely is the frequency of stuttering or the type of stuttering. To me, very frequently, the stuttering problem is that people are talking for the child, people are teasing the child, making fun of them, doing things. That's the problem we have to work with, not necessarily just the core stuttering behaviors.
A lot of brilliance packed in there. And for some people listening that have to go, yes, playback available on Facebook, playback also. All these conversations with all these sages and up and coming stars are all available on our website. And I'll also share it with Joe if in any way that he wants to share it. But on our website, schneiderspeech.com/our blog. Okay, that's where we have a repository of all the past stuff and the upcoming stuff on schneiderspeech.com/events. If you have questions, just pop them in here. Joe, a couple hellos from Jim Fortunato and from John Gomez, who says he enjoyed spending last year ISAD with you.
Yeah, exactly.
Sarah Vogel.
Congratulations on getting married, Jimmy. Jimmy just got married 2 weeks ago.
Hey, all right. You want to make a toast? It's too early.
Mazel tov.
There you go. Mazel tov.
You like that one? Yeah.
That milkix. I loved it
too. Cilantro is in Gaelic. So.
Yeah, you know, you'd be surprised. I'll just mention, I connected with some of our colleagues. I posted a picture of somebody. I don't know if you saw it on Facebook, and I wanted to see who could identify the picture.
Yep.
Did you know who that was?
I did not. The beard.
That's Bela Fleck. He didn't used to have a beard. He's like David Letterman, right? He's morphed into an outdoors, you know, living in a shack and creating great music. But Bela Fleck has a Gaelic set that he does with banjo and bluegrass fused with some Gaelic stuff.
Oh, I
love it. I get up and people start wondering why I'm doing river dance, and I can't contain myself. So I've got that in me.
Excellent.
You know, Joe, you shared so much right there, and you wanted to bring it back to the research, and then you went back to talking about what might be called a lot of soft stuff.
Yeah.
You know, how they doing here, how they doing there. Number one, do you have any assessment measures that you like to include or recommend in engaging those things, or do you navigate that in a dynamic way? And number two, maybe we can get into everything you were talking about the stuff that can accompany stuttering. You might have a young person who stutters who's also got something else going on.
Right.
Think about that for 1 second. I actually just remembered I wanted to reflect on something you said. For people that don't know, this is like an advanced workshop here with Joe Donaher. So for anyone that is not able to unpack all that wisdom, I just want to share there's a concept from Joseph Sheehan of the iceberg, right? And there's an experience of stuttering that can be seen and can be heard by people on the outside. And that's on the top of the iceberg. That's what you see sticking out. There's also a mass that exists beneath the surface that you don't see. And I often point out that's probably what the Titanic hit. They didn't run into something they saw. It was probably a mass that spread out beneath the surface. And oops, you know, didn't notice that the radius around that was that wide. Without getting into that, what Joe mentioned, severity. If we only measure severity by what we see and what we hear, there are many people who stutter, whose stuttering is quite pronounced, quite strong, quite observable, and they would score very high on behavioral metrics. But frankly, it doesn't bother them that much. For some, they've gotten accustomed to it. For others, they're quite disturbed, quite bothered, and holding back a ton. But the surface behavior is not the be all and end all, because you've got people on the other side whose experience is, it's a more mild physical trait. They've learned how to hide it, to stuff it in, and their significance of their experience and the impact on their communication life can be very, very significant, while at the surface they would score very low, mild, or even told they don't stutter, based on what people would see. So I think what Joe is alluding to is the importance of looking at, the whole person above and beneath the surface, and that severity is much greater than just a one factor bean count of stuttered moments, which is what some measures like the SSI, which was used as the gold standard for a long time, is limited in that way. And some of the new metrics are much more helpful. So things like the Kitty Cat or the Oasis for clinicians that are looking for tools like that can give you a full picture if you're not able to do it. But what do you use? What's your assessment?
I've used all of them for different purposes and different times, but it's interesting because we want to branch out from just looking at behaviors and stuttering. This isn't new. This has been around for many, many years. The question always is how to do it. And there's been different packages to do it. I mean, Charlie Healy and Lisa Scott, two of my mentors in the field, and Mike Suska have the COMS model. And so they were really trying to get you to look at more than the motor behavior. So they want, oh, sorry, you're out. Okay. They want you to look at the cognitive piece, the affective piece, and everything else. And I would say that's a great way to expand it out. But there's even further distancing we have to do. If we look at how someone handles their stuttering or the impact of their stuttering on their life, we have to look at how they handle other things in their lives. So there's going to be congruence between how they handle their stuttering and how they handle other things. And some of the things we know that impact the way you approach things are your level of reactivity and regulation, for example. And so you talked about some of the other issues that come in with people who stutter. And people who stutter have other problems too. So if 5% of the population...
Some of them, like Darren Sproles, are short. Some of them are tall. Some of them have red hair. Some of them are Irish.
If you think that the regular population, let's say 5% struggles with ADHD, because this is an area I do a lot of work with, why wouldn't we think 5% of people who stutter are going to have concomitant ADHD? Right? So what we look at is we look at how reactive kids are, how they regulate their emotions. We look at their temperament, right? We know certain kids get excited and are going 0 to 90 miles an hour in a second. Some kids, you say to them, today's Thursday, and they say, oh my gosh, I love Thursday. And then other kids, you say, today's Thursday, and they say, yep. And they're slow to interact, they're slow to move. Your intervention is going to be so different depending on what the individual brings to the table. So if I have someone who's go aggressive, I'm going to have to work probably at ways to get them to hit the brakes a little bit at times. If I'm working with someone who's really kind of struggles to share their emotions, struggles to feel comfortable getting anything out, then I'm going to have to work in a different area with them. So I want to know a little bit. So I've used temperament scales over the years. I tend to do more of it just informally. And if I think there's an issue, I'll pull something. I've done a lot of different types of scales. We look at locus of control. We look at comfort. We look at self-confidence. And self-confidence, one of my favorite variables. It doesn't mean that you're going to be perfect. It just means that you believe you have a shot of being successful. And that's very different than thinking you have to be perfect. Right.
I like to remind people, kids are born with self-confidence. You don't see a baby born who's scared to crawl.
Yep.
It's more a factor of, do you have experiences along the way that protect that nurture that give you the feeling like you can test the boundaries and go a little bit further, or you get the message from the world that, to be extra careful. And sometimes that's a innate part of their temperament, right? And then sometimes it's something that can be facilitated or inhibited by different things that parents and teachers and families can do. Why don't you get into the ADHD thing? And I think, because I think, that's your, I don't know what to call it, but your passion, the thing that people love to hear the most from you. And I hear about it all the time, and you're the guru. So when it comes to the kid, first of all, I'll just say my piece. I don't, I've worked with kids with all types of issues. I worked in a school for kids with all kinds of intelligence, but specific scattered profiles. So they had significant learning disability in reading difficulty or language difficulty, but otherwise mathematical geniuses, or kids who had social difficulty, pragmatic difficulty, but otherwise language masters and Nobel laureates with their poetry. So when you're dealing with this, I don't like labels, but they're helpful to get a sense of what we're dealing with. So I go phenomenological. So if you got a kid, like you said, oh, it's Thursday. It's my favorite day. On Thursdays, we get this for lunch, and then we do this after school. And they're revved up, and they're talking like, what I often say, whatever the speed of the family is, like they're like 10 miles an hour, 15 miles an hour above that.
Yep.
You know, they're in the left lane and then going into the margins, passing everybody.
Yep.
What's your consideration in terms of what do you bring to the table in terms of how you think about, okay, this is a kid with a lot of rev, a lot of maybe a bit of impulsivity, difficulty with inhibition, difficulty with self-regulation, maybe. And he also, when he starts going like that, he's not maybe bothered by it, but it starts to be like a bucking bronco with the stuttering, because it's like hitting the gas and the brakes at the same time. And the system starts to kind of show those hiccups of fluency, but the kid is so spirited. And the concern is we don't want to hurt the spirit. We don't want to hurt the self-image of the kid. And at the same time, how do we help a kid who's like revving like a Bugatti? When
and we have to think about this.
Yeah,
it sounds simple when you just say revving like that, and I use the word zooming all the time. I love that we have similar vernacular there, but it sounds so easy. Oh, the kid's just zooming, or he's going like this, but that's in every area of his life, right? And so we have to think about this when we think about ADHD, when we think about any of these areas, talk about learning disability or any, really all those labels is a set of characteristics that are pushed together because they commonly come together. And I understand there's a ton of problems with labels. I'm not going to get into that, but it also helps us some because we see some of these characteristics. It gives you a place to think about. One thing I want to really stress, though, is there are no good or bad traits, right? Impulsivity, all this kind of stuff, often we think of it as negative, but if we think of like energy level, right? I coach a lot, right? On my team, I want a kid that is like the Energizer Bunny that can just go, 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 will not worry about fouling or anything like that. He'll just go, right? I want that on my team.
Like Jane Fraser.
Yeah, I would like Jane. If you want to play point guard on my team, Jane, you can play point guard. But if you think about that same kid, the next day you go to church, those characteristics that were great on the field are not great there.
You don't like when he's sitting right behind you and like kicking the back of your seat.
Exactly. So we really have to think about goodness of fit. So I agree with you. There's no characteristic, that we have to say is bad or whatever. But what we look at for individuals, let's start with the family unit because we learn our rate and rhythm of speech and communication style and so much of what we do in our home communication. If that fit between the child's temperament and the parent's temperament isn't a good fit, so let's say the child's go, 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 and the parents are slow, 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 that fit's going to cause a lot of friction. So
there you go again, Joe. There you go with the vernacular. We're saying the same thing. Friction and traction, right? So like rightness of fit could be thought of how much traction, how much are we clicking versus
Correct.
How much is it creating either communication breakdown or negative feedback or frustration on either side, whether it's for the teacher, for the church pew fellows, or for the family. Yeah.
Yeah, and what's interesting too, and we talked a little earlier about the field when I started in it kind of, but one of the biggest changes in our field right now is I talked about how we had the professional community and then the self-help community, and they were merging a little bit, but not a whole lot. It's still dictated. We work so many years on awareness and acceptance, and we work with individuals on being accepting of your own stuttering and put it out there and don't avoid and do all of this. But at the same time, the community, the real community in the world that they were living wasn't necessarily as open and as accepting of stuttering. And I think what I see is the most exciting part of our field that's changing right now, and it started a little bit with the King's Speech, but it was started before that, but that kind of pushed it up, is all of a sudden people understand stuttering a little bit more, and they're able to talk about it a little bit more. And now what we're seeing is, for many people who stutter, the support organizations are what gave them a sense of community. But that community was supposed to be a microcosm of the larger community, and it wasn't always. And so
it was like a bubble. It was like a bubble. It was like the NBA. It was the NBA in Disneyland. And now it feels like, right, more campfires in a good way. More campfires are catching fire. And this today is so special for anyone that wants to know, without getting into politics, zero politics, but Joe Biden putting the topic of stuttering in the media, putting the topic of stuttering on the table and discussing it. Our colleague Craig Coleman did a really nice breakdown of how to look at that and what is maybe a moment of cognitive linguistic block or hiccup, and what is a stutter and what does that mean and how should that be regarded, and what's legitimately a way to relate to that. Obviously, if a student doesn't know the answer and they're hesitating, there's one type of response. But if the student is hesitating because they know the answer, but they just can't fire it out on the response time schedule that the class expected, needs to be responded to differently, which is, so rightness of fit. So how do you problem solve that? What do you go to?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things we do is talk about it. So the more a child realizes, and we go back to ADHD, for example, we know that most kids with ADHD have some kind of social impact of it, negative social impact to it. So when they see that they're interacting with peers is being impacted by their impulsiveness or by their distractibility, you can talk about that. You can talk about, I'll use a lot of, especially with kids who stutter, in ADHD, I see 3 patterns typically. We see those young kids who are just excessively disfluent, typical disfluencies, but a lot of them. And that typically has to do with the increased use of more words for kids with ADHD. They use more words to describe the same thing. They're hypervocalic. So those typical disfluencies at high levels expected. The second thing we see is for kids who stutter and have ADHD, the ADHD makes it much harder to handle their stuttering. So for example, if we're expecting them to monitor their speech, to look at times that they avoid or times that they backed up or times they want to do something different, that online monitoring for someone with ADHD is extremely difficult, okay?
I like to talk about that as like, you don't know that you need to change the oil or pull over because you're overheating the engine unless you have a dashboard. And kids with ADD don't have as crisp the ability to kind of like take all those metrics and have a sense, and we're asking them to adapt and modulate all kinds of things, but you can't change what you don't know. You can't regulate.
I'll change that analogy a little bit and I'll steal it after this. I like it. You have your dashboard in your car, right? And you're driving in your car and you see your different meters that you have. Someone with ADHD has countless meters that they have. So it's not that they're distracted and can't focus on the meter right in front of them. It's that they have so many meters that they can't figure out which one to focus on, right? And so what we do is we have to talk to them about what does this mean? How do you monitor your speech? How do you do whatever? I'm working with a child right now who's working on these. He has these spurts of speech that it's like the gun goes off and he just zooms and goes in it. And we're talking a lot about that, but we're working really hard on awareness of what his communication pattern is now, because why would he change? Why would he take the risk? Why would he try and put all that effort into doing something different if he didn't see the rationale for why he should do something different?
So for the kid with ADHD, it's so important to make explicit the motivational value, because the things we ask people to do, as you said, avoidance, natural thing. Unless there's a benefit that outweighs the cost, we're all going to pull back. None of us, we see an expensive car, we like it, but the cost hurts more than the value that it seems to offer. We're going to avoid it. We're going to step back. Being invited to a holiday party that's more stressful and has more people and more time commitment and more time suck than we're interested in investing, we're going to avoid it. Yep. But for the kid with ADHD, I think, as you said, they're going to be less compliant, not because they're oppositional, but they don't necessarily notice the things that other people might notice. And sometimes it's a blessing, right? Because they might not be bothered themselves by some of the interruptions that someone else would be intrinsically, intrapersonally bothered by. And they might steamroll over other people, not because they're inconsiderate, but that is the social pragmatic side effect of the experience of ADD. Get real with us, Joe.
The other thing with that is I said 2 patterns that I see. There's also a third pattern we see a great deal of for older kids who stutter. I mean, for older kids with ADHD, we'll see a disfluency pattern that looks almost identical to cluttering. And I would say it is cluttering. And so if you think about the same areas of the brain, everything that's going on right there, they're very repetitive, limited awareness, limited kind of ability to monitor it. And
narrative structure, you're often going to see with the kids with ADHD, also language markers,
same thing, right?
Their narrative structure.
Now, the problem with that, though, is so I get a lot of kids with ADHD who come in who are in speech therapy, and they have ADHD, and they're highly disfluent, but their disfluencies don't look like stuttering behaviors. They're not avoiding speech like someone who stutters, and yet the therapists are working on easy onsets with them, right? And I see this all the time. And so that's, again, when we go back to when we're talking about what do you do with someone who stutters in the beginning, and I said, yeah, I have no idea. We got to learn what's going on a little bit. That's a perfect example, because if you have this person's stuttering, so you teach them the one stuttering technique, and then guess what? They're not successful, and you blame the individual because they're not doing it right. Whereas what we want to look about is what's going on first before we know what we need to adjust. And so for kids with ADHD, especially those kids who have more cluttering behaviors, monitoring, rate reduction, things like that we would typically use for cluttering are going to be much more helpful than a stuttering technique, because the child's not really stuttering.
That's a huge 4-hour workshop right there. But I was going to say, I wanted to get real, push you against the wall, just as an expression. Do you medicate these kids? Do you avoid medication because it's going to whack out their fluency? And besides medication, I'm a big student of Rady and Hallowell and that whole camp, and all kinds of different holistic ways of looking at things. Anyone interested in this topic, the best conference, as Joe said, it's not always in your field only. I loved Learning in the Brain. Have you ever gone to their conferences? Learning in the Brain? Oh my gosh. And that's where I met John Rady and a bunch of these guys, and Ed Hallowell. We worked together in New York a little bit. These guys talk about several things. There's medication, but there's also other things. I was wondering if you had any insights on what you like to recommend. We're talking about how you get stuttering therapy to fit that kid, but then there's also the thought, like, if there's anything we can do to help the kid be more settled, be more grounded, be more available, the same way you want them to be more available for learning, while not stifling or taking them away from their, I call it, it's a superpower and a kryptonite. As you said, it's a superpower on the field and it's a kryptonite for sitting still in church, in different situations. So what are your thoughts, and how do you advise those parents? Maybe we'll wrap on that.
Yeah, if I wanted to be snarky again, I would say to you, which child with ADHD and stuttering? But here's what I want you to, and I truly mean that, though, that this is so individualized, because every person reacts to the medications completely different. And there's no guidance on the medications for ADHD and stuttering. There's little guidance for ADHD. There's so many different medications. It really depends on what your doctor, what trend he's getting into and stuff like that, or she's getting into. So as far as the medications go, there's not a single medication that we would recommend or not recommend. I will point out a study that Charlie Healy and myself did years back, and we took a child who was stuttering fairly severely and was on ADHD stimulant medications. And we know that stimulant medications can increase tic-like behaviors and increase some stuttering-like behaviors in some individuals. So
for some kids, right?
Yeah, in some kids. So what we looked at is this child's family took him off the stimulant medication because the stuttering had gotten so bad. When they took him off the stimulant medication, his grades bounced down. His participation in school was really disrupted because of impulsivity and things like that. And his stuttering went down a little bit, but not that much. So it really was the first time I had to look at quality of life and really look at what's the best thing here to impact this child's functioning. So in that family, they tried a different medication for ADHD, a non-stimulant, a different class that doesn't have the excitability piece there. They tried that, and they said it helped a lot with the attention and focusing. Not as much as the stimulant med, but they were willing to do that and get some improvement because it didn't impact the stuttering or other areas as much, and didn't have the side effects that they didn't want. So the other problem with this, though, is medications for ADHD, there's no consistency. The only consistency is inconsistency. And what works for a while stops working, and you always have to kind of be problem solving and keeping on top of that. So the big push for that is to really keep on top of it with a team. We talked about the relationships before, but in management of things like this that are so complex, you need a really good team, a neurologist, a speech language pathologist, often counselors and psychologists are involved, and that family has to be actively involved.
Wow. So would it be fair to say, as you said, it's predictably unpredictable, and reliably unreliable and all that, but
don't be frustrated if it takes time to
that's right. It's a dynamic thing, and similar to stuttering, it's just nonlinear. But one thing is for sure, I think what I find helpful, would you agree, is that, like you said, problem solving. And if you're not experienced in this, figuring out, well, what are the metrics, what are the KPIs, what are the indicators, what's that dashboard as a professional or as a parent or as a teacher, besides just the Connor scales or whatever, like how are they functioning in class? How many times are you having to reprimand them for their behavior? How many times are they forgetting things that they legitimately did, but they were just too energized to remember to pack that homework? When those things are coming up, that's when you might be motivated to do something more. And if things are coasting and doing well, whether it was indicated or thought to be, or they just stopped meds on their own, no one told them to, but things are going well, it's more about figuring out what to look for, I think, is the real wisdom there. What do you say?
Yeah. It's problem solving, not solving problems.
Oh man, that's so good. But you could also say, problem solving starts with figuring out the problem.
Yeah. Sure.
You can't start on the back end, and that's Kristen Camella's.
I'll say a quote that my father said years and years, and yesterday was his birthday, so I'll be very happy to quote him. He said,
Wonderful.
You can't make rabbit stew until you catch a rabbit. And so if you don't know what the problem is and what you need to address, you can't move forward in doing.
You know what? Rabbits are not milchiks and they're not fleischiks. They're just not on the kosher menu. So I haven't made rabbit stew, but clearly I wouldn't even known that. So
Yeah.
I'm grateful for your dad's wisdom so that the next time I'm thinking about it, I know what to do. This has been a pleasure. I wanted to just give you a chance. If anyone wanted to contact you, if you want to share any contact info or any exciting ways that you've got stuff coming up, and then if you had any parting wisdom.
Yeah, well, my email is always the best way to contact me. I read it every day. I try to answer as many as I can, so feel free to do that. Closing wisdom, I think this is a really exciting time in our field. I mean, your series with talking with these folks, I've really enjoyed that, to see different people's takes on it. And I think you've done a very nice job at putting an eclectic mix together. So it's not all professionals. It's not just teens. It's not just the parents. You really have a nice mix there. And I think we should all be encouraged, because stuttering is being talked about. In the political arena this year, it's being talked about a great deal. In social networks, it's being talked about a great deal. And I understand that it's hard sometimes to talk about this, but the more we talk about it, the more we normalize it, and the more that other people who have no connection to stuttering start learning what they need to do. And we think about stuttering, we think about someone who stutters, we can't put all the responsibility on them to change public opinion and change perceptions. So we have to start thinking about, why is it acceptable to make fun of stuttering? Why is it acceptable to make fun that someone who stutters has a cognitive impairment? Why is that okay in our society right now? And what's really interesting is those discussions are being had not just by geeks like us who are really involved in this. Those conversations are coming out from other people now. So I think
I've never been so flattered to be called a geek.
Yeah. But you know what I mean? Like, it's really interesting to me that last year at ASHA, this was pretty funny, that big article came out in the Atlantic right during ASHA last year from John
Hendrickson. John Hendrickson today, just a quick plug, later today, part of ISAD Day, Cody Packer from New Zealand and John Hendrickson are going to do a Facebook Live conversation. So John is the author of the article you're talking about.
Yep, John and I are close. So I'm excited to listen to him today. I'll have to listen to him. But when we think about it, like, that article came out, and I remember at ASHA leaving the convention, I'm in my room, I just want to decompress for a few minutes, and I put on cable news, and they're talking about stuttering. And I'm like, where am I? What's going on here? This is kind of odd. You know, you're already in that ASHA bubble there. But I think we're really in a great space where we're really talking about it. It's an acceptable conversation, and people are talking about it all over the world. And I think that's exciting.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I think the excitement of someone like you taking the time out of your schedule to share your wisdom so freely without any incentive, full disclosure, there are no monetary incentives. This is totally voluntary. The two of us taking the time to share conversations for the public good. We care about this topic. We care to learn more about it. We learn from each other. I certainly from you. And I really appreciate you doing that. And I just want everyone else here to know that this is totally on, Joe's time and his family's time. So appreciate that. And I think for ISAD Day, I think the takeaway from what you said, people can think whether you stutter or not. If you're listening right now, International Stuttering Awareness Day, this is the most exciting time because it's now. And we can take all the wisdom and experience we have from the past and create a better tomorrow for all of us. And the idea of making stuttering a more acceptable topic to talk about, to address, to put on the table, it can be uncomfortable and awkward, but similar to other conversations that are happening in our country and need to happen, we need to have these uncomfortable conversations. And by doing that, they've become less uncomfortable. And the people that have been on the short end of the stick are given a more of a fair chance to play. And I think I really liked what you said about the onus is not all on the person who stutters, right? They depend on a good dyad, a good environment, a good partnership, a good family, a good school teacher. That can make the difference. There's plenty of research that shows that one caring adult can make the difference between someone turning out to be a statistic of suicide or of incarceration or going into all kinds of drug and other trouble. One caring adult, one understanding, supportive adult, whoever you may be, can make the difference in a person's life. Understanding, do your part. Tell someone else what you've learned today so that they know a little bit better how to understand and treat a child or a young person or an adult, whether it's in personal or professional context. Thanks for taking the time. Hope everyone enjoys. Check out the replay on schneiderspeech.com/our blog. And big thanks to Joe Donaher. And we've got lots of great things coming up the rest of the day. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks.